Welcome to the Second Renaissance podcast. Artists, activists, contemplatives, and visionaries forging pathways through the metacrisis to a second renaissance and a wiser, weller world.
Welcome to the Life Itself and Second Renaissance podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Manda Scott, who is an award-winning novelist and the host of the acclaimed Accidental podcast. She's best known for the Boudica Dreaming series and has had multiple awards for her writing, including being shortlisted for the Orange Prize. And her latest novel is Any Human Power, which is a mytho-political Thrutopian thriller which lays out a roadmap to a flourishing future we'd be proud to leave to generations that come after us. Also, I think which is fascinating is that Manda has degrees in veterinary medicine and a master's in regenerative economics, and her life is oriented towards creating radical new narratives that will pave the way to the systemic change our culture and our world desperately needs. And
thank you.
Welcome, Manda. And I wanted to start with this quote in your book about Ursula Le Guin. Right at the start, which it gives also, I think, the title to your book, which is, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, the art of words." Can you tell me a bit about that quote, what it inspired in you, and Ursula Le Guin to start with?
Well, Ursula Le Guin is one of my greatest writing heroes. She was a genius. She was an amazing beacon of the fact that it was possible to write something that people would consider to be fantasy and still be writing deeply moving, very thoughtful, literate, and emotionally literate work with huge depth. And the world can be a different place. So when I got to the point where I thought I had stopped writing, but I am a shamanic practitioner, which we can discuss if we need to, and I had a series of visions, and part of the visions was you need to start writing again, and you need to write a book that takes you from where we are towards that future that would work. And in terms of titles, I wanted it to be really clear exactly what she says, because there's another very famous quote that it's easier to imagine the total extinction of all life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And that needs not to be the case. And who said it better? Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings, and capitalism is just, we make it up. It's an agreement we all make. If we all woke up tomorrow and decided clean air, clean soil, clean water, clean connections within all parts of ourselves, between ourselves and each other, and ourselves in the web of life, were what really mattered, capitalism would be gone by the end of the day. It's a choice that we all make moment by moment. And just because we are bamboozled into thinking this is somehow the way the world is, does not make that true. So stick it on the cover, any human power, and then at least people will read that little bit by Ursula Le Guin, even if they don't read anything else.
Wow. So in terms of that aspect of Le Guin, who's also a massive heroine of mine as a writer, this ability to envision, but also sort of a commitment that art is both beautiful and powerful, but also there's a kind of, our imagination is in service of something.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the book, Any Human Power, which, by the way, is out. It came out, I think, last year. Right?
Yep.
I highly
just
recommend it. Just
before the general election last year. I was not happy.
Yeah, I can imagine. So tell me about both of those things. Tell me a little bit about the book, and tell me a little bit about how it even connects to current politics. Yeah. So
Yeah. Okay, so we're calling this mythopolitical, which is a phrase that I made up, which is cracking because it means I can define what it means. And also Thrutopia. So Thrutopia is a phrase that Rupert Read coined. He's a professor at UEA, part of the Climate Majority Project, as you know. And he wrote a paper back in 2017 where he was discussing Ursula Le Guin and the dispossessed. He published it in Huffington Post. And part of the visions on the hill where you need to write this book, here's the first scene, here's the rest. I can talk a bit about those. But also, you need not to be the only person doing this. We need a lot of people writing potential visions through. Nobody said of capitalism, there's only one way to destroy the planet, you have to do it this way. What happened was we ended up in a trauma culture where we believe ourselves separate from the web of life, and we create a value system based on our sense of scarcity, separation, and powerlessness, and we elevate the dark triad. And lo, there are multiple ways to destroy the planet and each other and ourselves. So instead, what happens if we create a different value base? What happens if we do the inner work? What happens if we show, this is what Ursula Le Guin didn't do, and I think she could have done, I just think it wasn't obviously essential when she was writing, was to show the path through. Because The Dispossessed is lovely, but it's set on another planet. It's not even here with a jump cut, but most utopias, there's a jump cut between here and there, and you can't see how to get there. And dystopias, we don't need any dystopias, we're living the dystopias. And anyone who does any energy work knows that you get where you put your attention. Where you put your attention is where you go. And so we don't need any more examples of what happens when The Handmaid's Tale meets the road. We can see it happening in real time, and it's lazy. I get really cross with my writing colleagues now who think that they're going to write the dystopia that's going to change everything because we see how bad it could be from their point of view. You will start to think like they do, and then you will do things right. And it doesn't work like that. The whole of our cognitive neuroscience, if you frighten people, you just spring up the sympathetic system, dorsal vagal. People go into fight, flight, or freeze, which is basically denial, despondency, or despair. And unless you offer motivation, direction, agency, and empowerment, what can they possibly do? And I put in an application a little while ago for somebody who was offering some R&D money for a grant to explain the climate science more clearly in innovative ways in film. And we put in an application because why wouldn't you? But part of the application, you only had 350 word sections, was the knowledge deficit model went out about 20 years ago. It's not about explaining the climate science more clearly. That doesn't help anybody unless you give them a vision of what could be different and clear, clean steps to get there that they feel empowered to do. So that was the aim of the book. When I came down off the hill, that's what I knew I needed to write. And I needed to set up a writing masterclass, not to teach people how to write, but to give them the ideas. Because if I hadn't been doing the Accidental Gods podcast for 2.5 years by the time I had the visions, I wouldn't have had a clue what was possible. And I had. So what I wanted to do was to give other writers the baselines of what kind of alternative politics already exists. What is Audrey Tang doing in Taiwan? What's happening with distributed democracy and various forms of distributed governance? How could we create money differently? How could we use money differently? What different ways of exchanging and storing and accounting for value could there be? How could we create power differently? How could we distribute power differently? How could we have different transport or urban design or politics? And I was bringing in people to do the spiritual work. So I phoned up Rupert and said, hey, do you want to come on this? And he said, what's it called? I haven't got a name for it yet. And he said, it's a Thrutopia. You're running a Thrutopian class. Says, okay. So for me, a Thrutopia is any creative endeavour that starts in a recognisable present and walks us through, gives us a clear roadmap to a future that we would be proud to leave to the generations that come after us. And that's key. I want 7 generations down the line, my grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, not that I have children, but my partner's grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, to look back at us and go, yes, they did it. They left it way too late. They could have done it a lot sooner. But when it really mattered, they got together, they worked out common values, they worked out stories that would lift them and take them forward, and they chose a future that leaves us, the people who were not even ideas of being born then, a world that is flourishing, where we are an integral part of the web of life. I don't think we get through if we don't take our place as conscious nodes in the web of life. That was part of the visions that came before the ones that wrote the book. So that, the inner work, which you know with Second Renaissance, is, I think, the most important. But I am also aware that some people have not a sense of spirituality at all, and we're not excluding them. I lean very heavily into Joanna Macy's 3 pillars of the Great Turning. There's holding actions, which a lot are happening in the US at the moment. Judges are just going, no, I won't do that. Attorneys general are just resigning. All the things that can stop the havoc. There's systemic change, and people can work on systems change without necessarily doing the inner work, and up to a point they can get somewhere. And there's shifting consciousness. And the feeling that I have when I connect to the web of life as well as I am able, which is not necessarily as cleanly and clearly as we will eventually do, but it's the best I can do at the moment, is if enough of us commit to that, if enough of us become heart-oriented and move into a space of gratitude and compassion and joyful, amazing, wonderful curiosity where we are wholly in love with being alive, that creates a ripple effect, and it's easier for other people. Gurdjieff said it only took 80 fully enlightened human beings to change the world, but he didn't define what a fully enlightened human being was, and he didn't define changing the world. So anyway, there will be a critical mass. I don't know what it is, but I think it's quite important. So I think we need all of these. We need all three of the pillars of the Great Turning. And so the book, the first scene that I was given was of an old woman. She's not that old. She's the age I am now. And she's in her early 60s, lying on a bed, and her 15-year-old grandson is at her side. And he says, when you come home, can we go up the hill and watch the crows go to bed, which is what I had been doing when I had the visions. And she says, no, I'm not coming home. There is no coming home from here. I'm dying. You know this. We've had this conversation. And he's broken because reality kind of settles in. And in the course of their ensuing conversation, he says, I don't want to be in a world with you not in it. You're the only one that gets me. I don't want to be here if you're not here. And she realizes he's serious. And she says, I don't know what's coming next, but if you really need me and you call, I will do everything that I can to come. I promise. So an early working title of the book was The Promise. And then a book called The Promise won the Booker, so that one was out the window. And actually, I think Any Human Power is much better. So, but she makes the promise, and he and she and we and they all feel the gods look down and go, okay, that was a promise and you are held to that. And then she dies. And then the whole of the rest of the book is told from her perspective, having to hold to that promise. And she's locked in a kind of interstitial space between the lands of life and the lands of death, which is within the shamanic world's a really well-mapped space. It looks different to everybody, but the actual existence of it, and in Buddhism it's called the bardos, there's all kinds of ways of looking at it. And so I was also trying to create another mythology, as well as then having someone who's got the perspective of age, and then the thriller arc of the book, because I like writing thrillers, they're fun, is pushed by her 14-year-old granddaughter who was conceived on the night of her funeral. So I had got the age spread as wide as I can get it. And when Caitlin is 14, she posts a tweet, because Twitter was still Twitter at that point. And she sparks a worldwide movement for political change, a worldwide movement that says the old system is not fit for purpose. You guys can do whatever the heck you like with your completely dysfunctional system. We are going to create a system that actually works. And we're going to do it peacefully, and we're going to do it within the law. And so that works through. And I had hopes that we would have at least 6 months from when it was launched at the end of May till the UK's general election, in which we could have made it happen. And instead, at the point when it was irrevocably committed to being launched, they called a general election in June. So I was a little bit unhappy. But we've got time. There's another election, probably the last one ever, if we don't want Andrew Tate as Prime Minister in the UK, we need to make this happen. So I think it's still relevant, and I think there's an increasing movement. George Monbiot put out a video with Double Down News about a week ago, and it's 3.5 minutes, and 3 minutes and 25 seconds are, look, the world is falling apart, and the 5 seconds at the end is, and now we need a new political movement. I would have framed it differently, but we need a new political movement. We need to understand that the existing system is not fit for purpose. It's not that it's broken. It is doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is to shovel power into the hands of the smallest number of people at the top. And that is not fit for purpose, and there are better ways. So it's a mythical. I'm trying to create a new mythology. It's an exploration of death and dying and what the boundary lines between life and death and the agency that we might have when we're dead or not. And it's a concrete exploration of political transits.
Wow. Thank you. I mean, and, so I think also, I'm not going to give it away too much from the book. I mean, I think there's a very dramatic midpoint of the book, a very powerful dramatic midpoint of the book. What I think is also interesting, as you say, is like actually being more anchored in the present, the near present. How do we navigate the bottom of the U is a great challenge of most future books. There's always this, as you say, this jump cut.
That's a jump cut. Yeah.
I mean, I have a kind of a question. I want to come back to the question of the politics today and what you see we could do. That's very relevant. I want to come back to that and to the kind of second Renaissance, Thrutopian, regenerative future. But I first want to ask the kind of jump cut of your life. So you start out, like, just to come back here, that's come to this point, because I think this is something that we're very interested in also, is how to, not say you're an ordinary person, but rather than being some special heroic people, how do ordinary people end up walking this kind of out of the ordinary path? So you start out as a veterinary surgeon, is that right, or a vet, and then you've moved into crime novels, and then I guess artist, activist, shaman. Can you tell me a little bit how you? I mean, like you first became a vet, then you became a novelist. Tell me a little bit about this journey.
So I think part of the key to that is that I grew up in a tiny village in Scotland, a little Presbyterian village with the twitching net curtains and everything that goes with it. And when I was 9-ish, I read The Last of the Mohicans, and I read The Weird Son of Brazingam and the Moon of Gormrath by Ellen Garner, and Mary Renault's Crystal Cave in Hollow Hills. And my dad took me to the Brochs in Scotland, which are big Paleolithic. They're about 70, 80 feet across. They're double-walled stone. They're stone-built, dry stone. And the walls at the bottom are quite wide because the cattle lived in between the walls in the winter. And then they curved up like a beehive and got narrower as they got up. And there were 7 stories. And so cattle in the bottom, then hay, then grain, then other things. And the people lived in the middle. And I had just read the things aforementioned, and which had made me aware that there were other gods than the one that I had been told about, which had never made sense to me, and that these were gods of the land. I'd also read The Eagle of the Ninth, which is Rosemary Sutcliffe. Young man comes north. Exactly. Yep. He's come to try and find the eagle of his father's legion. And later I wrote The Eagle of the 12th, because it turned out that the 9th didn't actually lose their eagle, but the 12th did, which was, in fiction terms, a gift. But anyway, he comes north looking for the father's eagle, and he meets the people of the Seal tribe, west coast of Scotland, so my place. And the priests of the horned moon god have got the eagle for sure. We never see it with them, but we know they got it. And they go into what is effectively a long barrow, and the goat skin curtain door falls, and you never see what happens inside. And I was desperate to know what they were doing, because they were talking to the gods. They were talking to my gods. And she doesn't show. I read everything Rosemary Sutcliffe ever wrote, and she never tells you what they say and what they do. And from that point, my life's path was what was happening in there. And Dad took me to the Brochs not long after that, and my brother and he were walking around talking about geology, and I was just sitting there, and I could hear the whispers. I could hear people talking just out of range, and it's like, you've got to tell me this. I need to understand how to hear you. And I also wanted to be a vet, so I went off and did the whole left brain training stuff, but I also studied homeopathy and acupuncture at the same time. And I worked with a Druidic group in Edinburgh and learned Buddhist meditation, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. So I was always on that kind of parallel path. Came down to Cambridge, which was even more left brain. But that was mid-80s, and there was a short window, mid to late 80s, when Leah Rutherford and a couple of others who'd been to the US came back. They'd trained with Joan Rutherford, Michael Harner, and they brought Native American indigenous people who had, their spirits were telling them they had to start teaching white people how to connect to the gods of the land, because otherwise we were going to destroy the world. And they were very, very clear that we are not teaching you how to be us. We're teaching you how to connect to the gods of your land. You need to learn how to do this, but we can give you the tools that you have lost in the 2,000 years of Roman colonization. And the window was short because towards the end of the 80s, we live in the trauma culture. People don't understand. The people who didn't want us to be taught were going there to their children. They will not get it. It's not safe. And people started setting up courses where you pay me $1,000 and I'll teach you to be a shaman in a weekend, which is just not a thing and should not happen. And the doors shut. They didn't shut completely, but there was a real change. But I had been around. I was really lucky that every spare weekend I had, I was away doing this kind of thing. So I got the grounding before the doors shut. And then realised I didn't want to be a vet for the rest of my life. I was working at Cambridge. I loved it. I was teaching. It was grand, but it wasn't. I just needed to be doing other things. And the shamanic work was just pushing and pushing and pushing. And it led me to writing. And then it led me... I needed an apprenticeship, and writing crime novels while I was being a vet was much easier. I didn't have to do a huge amount of research because I understood physiology and pathology in the ways you could potentially hide murder. And I did the apprenticeship with that. And then I had another series of shamanic visions, and the Boudica books were much, much harder to write. I had to do huge amounts of research, but I also got a new publisher and was able to give up the day job and never really looked back until 2016, when a whole other set of shamanic visions, I ended up in Devon doing a master's in economics, which had been nowhere on my radar at all, until that point. But it was life-changing, and I'm so glad I did it, and I learned a huge amount. And I learned the depth and the breadth of the metacrisis, and that the answers are all here. It's not a problem. We know what we need to do. It's a problem of collective story and political will, and political will arises from collective story. So I got to understand all the way through. They would go around the class and say, "So what are you here?" And I go, "We need to change the narrative." And I didn't understand how, but I knew that we did. And then it took me a while, because I thought I set up the podcast because I thought writing's too slow. It just takes a long time to write a book and even longer to get it published. Until 2021, another set of visions and writing another book. That make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think, I mean, if for a moment I would like to go, I mean, well, first I hear is that in the moment, in a way, the books, there's been a shift, which is the writing is in the service, always was, but maybe is in the service of this vision and changing the narrative, which I think, as I say, one of my co-founders at Life Itself is Sylvie, who's really the art of the second Renaissance, this aspect that art, that quote of Ursula Guin, which actually what I love Ursula Guin, I hadn't come across so much before, is just so aligned with this idea that we need art because this is one way for us to see, it's how we change narratives. It's to some degree where narratives come from is our artists, or at least they channel them, I might say.
Yeah, both, I think.
I guess, by the way, I was also an economist for a while for my sins. I was at Cambridge actually as an economist. So the thing was even there, I was trying to do sometimes at point tongue in cheek. I never tried to publish it. Buddhist economics. What if we went? I don't know if you know economics. Traditional economics 101 is like we have unlimited wants. Scarce resources. So how do we kind of we're always going to be dissatisfied, but how do we kind of maximize given these unlimited wants and scarce resources and technology? Whereas obviously Buddhism
and Homo economics, who's always a logical actor and always does whatever is going to maximize.
Exactly, utilitarian actor. Where the thing versus whereas like in Buddhism, it's like, well, the path to well-being is not to get more stuff. It's actually you can transform wants. You can.
Yes.
There is, by the way, a funny. It's almost an irony of economics that the one part of the literature that deals with what are called in their, endogenous preferences, if you want to go look it up, either preferences that can change, got taken over by the Chicago school, who used it for rational actor models of smoking.
Yes.
But an addiction, what was called rational addiction.
Not by accident, I think. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to change the narrative, and they achieved it.
Yeah, and I think so. One is you had this incredibly powerful experience as a young girl, and then I think an interesting question for people that I'm also interested in is many people have strong experiences. I mean, I could say for myself, I had a really strong experience when got interested in psychedelics. Basically, I was reading pharmacology textbooks when I was 13, 14, and that led me to
Wow.
psychedelics. And then because I was like, whoa, they don't say that negative things. They say that's like really like no very few deaths. But the challenge I had is how people, I always say that for myself, I had to have kind of 3 goes to reach escape velocity kind of from the system for myself. In that I had these experiences, quite intense experiences, but I was kind of alone. None of my schoolmates were interested. My parents certainly weren't, weren't going to get it. And
Your
I
dad
was at
was a
the internet
lawyer.
moment. I didn't have Be Here Now, and so I was like, only
Right.
later I find Buddhism and things. So in your case, you had these experiences, and it seems like that, although you became a vet and you did the left brain, somehow this was always there. You said you started doing
Mm.
Buddhism. What is it that supported you? Was in your parental context, was that what had it that those intuitions were sort of nourished or continued to the sparks that were there
Mm.
continued to
That's a
burn?
good question. That's a really good question. Because I was very secretive at college. There was the kind of nerdy little girl who went in and did all the vet stuff, and nobody knew what I was doing at weekends. And it wasn't, I was particularly keeping it secret. It just didn't occur to me to tell them because it wouldn't have been their thing. And I was discovering that I wasn't heterosexual as well. And that was also something that I wasn't necessarily going to share with them. So I had very discrete parts of my life. And they didn't really come together until after I was no longer teaching at Cambridge, which was a good decade and a half later. I honestly don't know. I think I've always had a very powerful sense of connection to a particular set of deities. And I ask, what do I need to do? And they answer. And actually, once you've got that, and that sounds really arrogant, and it's not, the answer's not always clear, and I don't always manage to do what I think I need to do, but that's been there as a guiding thread all the way through, I think.
I think that's really insightful point, which is that there was like a depth of connection. I mean, I think this is a point, many people now make. Even the fact that I now talk openly about taking psychedelics, it's not something I did, when I was a research fellow at Cambridge.
No, I bet. Or at school.
But the thing that I noticed that now many people is that there's this aspect about that. I often call it the consumerism of enlightenment. The way, at least in the West, I know in the other traditions where it's much deeper, but this integration aspect, which is what I hear for you is when you have that depth of connection, which often with psychedelics, because it's this kind of incredible experience, then you're out, even though it reminds you, unless something, that shift is difficult. But I'm just saying, so that depth of connection was very powerful, is what I'm hearing for you. There was this, which and really nourished you on this path. So it kind of wants me to bring me then forward, which is, what at the moment do you think is happening? Like, what's the story you'd be telling? Because people I think also feel very lost right now. Like not everyone, but like what's going on?
Yeah.
What would you say has been unfolding? And it might go back thousands of years, and it might be like what's been happening in the last. But what's your story here in a way that you'd share with others to make sense with? Maybe not your neighbor next door, but in general.
No.
Perhaps.
Well, yeah, I would try with a neighbor next door. They just don't really get it. Some of them. Okay, so I would go a long way back. I lean very heavily into Francis Weller's concept of trauma culture and initiation culture. And so millions of years of human evolution, 64 million years since the last mass extinction, billions of years since we were hydrogen boiling in the sun. I read an article in, I think, Nature, read it online just before Christmas, and 800 to 900,000 years ago, there were 1,024 reproductively active individuals who are the progenitors of all humanity. I think that's amazing. We all go back to those people, and we probably go back to all of them. There's going to be mixed genes from all 1,024, because otherwise you have too small a gene pool. In fact, when we do population genetics, we're always told anything less than 2,500 is not a viable gene pool. So it's interesting that it was. But anyway, there's been bottlenecks before of really very few. And somewhere in that process, starting off, we grew, we evolved, we became the conscious nodes in the web of life. One of the really clear sets of visions that I had was of the blue pearl of the earth floating through the blackness of space, that vision from the moon of the earth. And around it, this mesh, really, really, really complex web of fine, fine fibres of light. And if I see it in daytime, they're sun-coloured. And if I see it in nighttime, they're moon-coloured. And at every crossing point, what I was told was is a node of consciousness. And some of those nodes are human, but most of them are not. And that what we've done is, in our culture, is cut ourselves off from knowing that. But for all of human evolution, until relatively recently, and still with indigenous cultures, the truly indigenous cultures that haven't been too traumatized, there is a knowing that we are the conscious nodes in the web of life, and that when I need to know what's mine to do, I ask the web. And so Weller's concept that he evolved with Malidoma Some is of the initiation culture, where there are intermittent, episodic, contained encounters with death. And the containment is held by the elders and the shamans and the people, but mostly by the web of life. So the individual ends up at the edges of themselves, and this happens multiple times through life. We all get a bit hung up on the adolescent one because we don't have it. But anyway, at multiple times, get to the edge, and death is a real potential. And yet we know that we can ask for help of the web of life. And if we ask, and if we are able to receive and embody that help, then we survive, and if we can't, then we don't. But if we do, we come back in whatever way, back from wherever, illness or adolescent initiations or birth, and we are celebrated by the tribe of the human and the more than human world. And then we have that set of serotonin enmeshes, our serotonin reward centers, which are characterized, or are they triggered by pride and respect, a reciprocal pride and respect. I am proud of what I do. I have respect for you, having pride for what you do, because what we are both doing is what we are here to do. I do what's mine to do that only I can do and that I can do really well. And serotonin networks have the characteristics of being enduring, long-term, and additive. Something happened 10 to 12,000 years ago. There was some kind of schism before our culture, the Western educated, industrial, rich, and until recently democratic culture, that practices agriculture the way we do, because that's enslavement of the land and everything that's on it. And you can't do that if you know yourself to be an integral part of the web of life. And we know that the Americas and Australia and the Amazon and everywhere, they were all managed landscapes, but they were managed with the land. It wasn't, let me put up fences and stone walls, and I own this bit of land and everything on it, and I tell it what it's going to grow. That's the trauma culture. And so Weller's definition of the trauma culture is that we don't have the containment for our encounters with death. We just encounter things that we don't have the skills or the knowledge or the resilience or the community to weather, because we don't know how to ask for help with the web of life. We have the scarcity, separation, and powerlessness. So we don't have the containment. We just have traumas that stack and stack and stack and stack and stack until they overflow, and we have a complete mental health crisis. And that we have a mental health crisis because we're seeking dopamine rewards now. I want another box from Amazon, or pornography, or alcohol, or cocaine, or whatever else. Or Jonathan Haidt did some really interesting work of, when I'm in a polarized situation of us versus them, particularly politically, and I think I'm going to lose and then I win, it's the equivalent of the most massive nose full of cocaine. And then I will want to do that again, which says a lot to where we are now. And the characteristics of dopamine reward centers is that they're short term. They're not cumulative. I can get a bit of dopamine from an Amazon box and a bit of dopamine from snorting cocaine. They don't add up. And they are subject to the laws of diminishing returns. So the Amazon box that I got yesterday does not give me as big a hit as the one that I get today, or the rocket that I send to Mars, because the richest man on the planet is on ketamine every other week for his depression. So, buying stuff, accumulating stuff is not filling the need for being and belonging that we get from connecting to the web and knowing that we are an integral part of that. So what I think is happening now is we've reached the limits of the trauma culture, our culture, the trauma culture, which we inflicted around in Britain. I would say the Romans brought it here. I think we were an initiation culture till then. It's only 2,000 years, and in 64 million years since the last mass extinction, that's nothing. And I think we're all born expecting to be born into that place where we are cherished and we're an integral part of a community in which we are held by the human and the more than human world. And part of the innate wounding of our culture is that we discover that we are actually basically alone. We're not, but the narrative of the culture tells us we are, and we're not given the tools to discover that that's not true. But I think we all yearn for it not to be true. And so I think we are in a point, for a long time I've been saying, when we were at college at Schumacher, we were trying to work out how we get the soft landing from predatory capital death cult to a regenerative future. And we never really worked it out because dismantling capitalism was going to be hard. And what was happening exactly as you and I speak is that the old system is being destroyed quite deliberately by people who think that they can impose a much more restrictive world order, but they don't understand complexity. You cannot control a hyper-complex system. It's not a thing. So I also lean quite heavily into Ilya Prigogine, who said that when any system reaches maximal complexity, it hits a bifurcation point. It either crashes into chaos and extinction or it emerges into a new system. And I would say we're at that bifurcation point about now. And chaos and extinction is a real possibility. But so is emergence into a new system. And the emergence into a new system, by definition, if we can predict it, it's not a new system. So it's unpredictable. But we can predict the baseline values of connection to all parts of ourselves, each other, and the web of life. I think we can predict baseline criteria of clean water, clean air, clean soil. Those are really basic. And until recently, they were obvious. It's only since we really began to harness ancient sunlight in service of polluting everything that those were not a given. So I think we can take ourselves to what Indy Johar calls the emergent edge of interbecoming in order to facilitate the emergence into a new system. And I think the destruction of the existing system by the straight white blokes with sledgehammers is shaking up enough people that the miasm of the old system, the business as usual, and it being easier to imagine the extinction of life on Earth than the end of predatory capitalism, is breaking apart. I hope so. I've stopped. I realise I'd talked for a long time.
No, it was wonderful. What I see is that so key in this arc is a sort of fall beginning in like 10 to 12,000 years ago, where we get this separation from the web of life and the sense of separation and scarcity. One of the aspects, I suppose, that I would ask is, how do you think well, I actually have two. One is, to what extent you said, like, there's predatory capitalism and there's the kind of, there's almost like kind of an intentionality. I always wonder, to what extent are people kind of caught in the grip of a system that sort of unfolds? We kind of, capitalism is not, and what extent do you think there's kind of agentic action there? And I think the more interesting question I actually have, so what I mean by that is, to some extent, we're just kind of victims of a system that we set up. It's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice story that Marx had about capitalism. Like, we unleash powers that we didn't realize, we started using the spell and we didn't realize it was going to like destroy the building and ourselves. And, versus there are kind of conscious agents who might have been formed, but are at least consciously continue to act in the kind of the death version of this. that's one question. I think the question we could come back. I think the more question is, how do you feel this emerges? So how, not as again, it is emergent, but what actions are there now in this Thrutopia that we have? Like, what helps spread these ideals? Is it? I mean, there's multiple things, but I guess most deeply, how do people actually encounter it? I mean, what I mean is that there seems to me when I often read things, and it's something that I'm kind of trying to collect examples of actually at the moment, is what are these moments where people have this phase shift? Often it's quite abrupt. I mean, the example I had recently, well, not that, but there's a man called Tony Parker that you may or may not have heard of. Tony Parker is very unusual. He basically interviewed people. He was an expert interviewing people, starting initially with criminals, and he did these series of books where he would, some of which are just, they should be basically novels. Like there's one with murderers in America on death, not on death row. One of them is about this Vietnam veteran. They're all true. They're real people. And he basically comes back traumatized from Vietnam, and he ends up working for a drug cartel. And the tragic end of this story is basically he realizes his girlfriend, who he really loves, is kind of an informer for the police. And he takes her out into the desert and kills her. But he ends up, he's caught for it and he wants to be. And he's like, it gives the title of the book. He's like, what brought me here? Like, it was the violence of our lives. What happened to us was part of the violence of this system. But anyway, there's that one. But I mention him because he has a thing about the miners' strike. He went out and interviewed a mining community after the end of the strike. But the thing I found most fascinating in that book, which is called Red Hill, you two actually wrote a song about that book, on Joshua Tree, called Red Hill, I think. But Tony Parker went out and interviewed people. And there's a couple of stories that struck me very different. He was partly just telling the story maybe of the tragedy of what had happened and how it happened. But there were two stories of women that really struck me with this book, where the women said, like, it's really been terrible. They were the wives of miners, but both of them had awakenings. One of them was like, I never read the news. I never did anything. And like one day I asked my husband, like he's on strike, and I asked him to explain what's going on. Like, why are you striking? And he explains about Arthur Scargill. And she's like, she basically becomes, politically awakened, and she starts going around England. She's never spoken before, and she starts giving talks to, other women about like what they're doing and why they should be supported. And the other story was about a woman who's like 24, 25. She's had a babe, even younger, and she's like, all I ever did was wanted to have a baby, and I don't read anything. And her husband comes home on strike, and one day she's kind of cooking and cleaning, and he's sitting like with his feet on the kind of table, and she says, well, you're not working now. And yet I'm still cooking and cleaning. I want you to cook and clean, and I'm going to go out and earn money. And she kind of does. And, my point of this story was that these moments when someone's worldview, in this case, these women kind of have this moment of empowerment and deep shift in a way of how they see themselves in the world. And anyone giving them lectures about women's liberation or empowerment wouldn't have worked.
It happened.
So I guess these moments of like, we can see and say, okay, people have got to see themselves. Now we don't know the answer, but what, and it's why also fascinating, you had this encounter at age 9 or 10, and then these other things, but what parts? I mean, obviously we should write novels, create art. I mean, as I said, and there are many things, there's not one thing that we're doing. But how, I guess, do you think people really touch hope, really touch the sense that we can rebirth, that we can have emergence upwards into something incredible? And as you say, I think you're like, let go of the death cult.
Yes.
What have you seen in your life where you've seen that? I mean, maybe it's yourself or others, or what you think we can be doing at the moment, and I know you've got your Accidental Gods community. There are things very concrete you're doing, and feel free to share about that. I mean, I know you also share your shamanic work and other things, but yeah, what is it that we can be doing?
That is such a good question. And that is the question for now, because it is, I know Bayo Komalafi says the times are urgent, we must slow down, but actually I think the times are urgent and we just need some ideas on the ground and working, and we need to get past the theorizing and into the actual doing. I think we also need, we're trying to work out what to call it. I had an interesting conversation with Tim Logan last week, and he said he'd spoken about the progressive left to a young woman who's set up a youth education for youth by youth. And she said, you can't call it that. We're exiting the entire system, and the old left-right thing is not relevant anymore. So I'm going for those of us who are committed to the continuation of complex life on Earth, which is not that catchy. We need a better word. But it's, that's committed to connection, to coherence, connection and courage and compassion and all the 8 C's of IFS. So I think you and I were talking before we came on air about we need community. We need communities of place, of purpose and of passion. And one of the amazing things about the fact that we have the internet, for as long as we have it, until Musk decides that he's got Starlink and he's going to close it down, is in the old days, communities were of place, broadly. And that's still incredibly important. But you're in France and I'm in Shropshire and we're still talking to each other in real time. You could be in Australia. We could be talking to each other in real time. Sharing our ideas is what makes this a hyper-complex system now. We can share ideas in real time. And I think that's really important because I think the roots in to the awareness that another thing is possible are probably, there are 8.5 billion roots in. But some of the ones that I've seen that work. So yes, we teach the shamanic work. I've been teaching it now for over 20 years. I have an apprentice who's doing most of the teaching. Thank you, Lou. And the students that come, they come because they come for a lot of different reasons. But basically what I'm offering is that we will help you to connect to the spirits of the land. And the kinds of questions they've been asking have changed a lot in the last 20 years. You know, way back in the 2000s, it was, what kind of job? Where do I go? You know, what kind of partner? Where do I live? And now, almost to a person, it's how can I help? And that's noticeable. And I have a sense that the help is much more accessible than it used to feel. And that may be because I'm 20 years more practiced at listening. But still, it feels to me as if the web of life is right there, really, really keen to be asked for help. So there's spiritual ways in. I think for me, all of the religions are religions of the trauma culture. Spiritual paths, particularly the indigenous spiritual paths, and we're all indigenous to somewhere. We can all talk to the spirits of the land where we are. There is always water. There is always a tree somewhere. The air is up there and the sky is above you and there's the moon and the sun and the earth and you can talk to them where you are. And that's a language that anyone can get, but not everybody wants to. I think places where democracy is being done differently. So Audrey Tang was in Thailand and their government's approval levels went from 9% to 82% in 7 years. Because she understood the nature of distributed democracy, was an absolute genius programmer. Audrey Tang is a genius on every level, and I think should be probably president of the world. It would be a very interesting place if she was, because she gives trust. She gets trust by giving trust. So she created a whole system of distributed democracy that worked, and she let people give them ideas, and they put them into practice. And they discovered that once you start asking people what their ideas are, they have some really, really good ideas. And people feel really good to have been empowered by being asked for what they can do. And that changes where people are at. Participatory budgeting changes where people are at. Anywhere participatory budgeting has been tried, the politics of the area shifts because people realise that it's okay to have ideas. A lot of the places where alternative forms of currency and value exchange have been tried, the politics begin to shift. And quite often they're shut down quite quickly. So the Universal Basic Income trial that started off in Canada was shut down as soon as the right got to power and was able to, because it's not a narrative that they want to go out there. But every time we do something like that, people understand. So I, again, just put in a grant application I wanted to run Audrey Tang style Zoom rooms, basically, in a bunch of communities where people hate each other. There's a lot of conflicts near here because of sewage going in the rivers and people with 1 million chickens in a chicken house, and all the effluent goes in the river and then the river's poisoned, blah. And so everybody hates the chicken houses except the people who work there, and the scientists who are monitoring the river hate the hippies who are creating effigies of the goddess of the river, and there's so much hatred. But what happens if you get those people in a room and you go, okay, you're not here to scream at each other. We just want to know what are the top 5 issues that you all agree on are important. Just work as a team tell us what your top 5 issues are. And here is an issue that some other group has decided is important to them. It's probably quite important to you too. What would you as a group do to fix this? And just that, get them working as a group, get them talking to each other as real human beings, get them solving problems that they do all actually care about, with facilitation from either human or Audrey's written the AI, so that you don't end up with just the most charismatic, powerful, bullying person soaking up all the oxygen in the room. Everybody gets a chance to speak, everybody gets a chance to put something forward. What would that do? What would that do if we were able to scale that out? What would it do? Forest Row is a East Sussex parish, and they had a tip that they really liked, council-run tip, that was being closed, and somebody stood for the council on the basis of, we'll keep the tip going, and they got in and the tip was still closed because the council said, no, sod you, we're going to close your tip. And so then they got together and they got independence. They were not politically aligned, and they said, we're going to run for the parish council. There's 21 people on the parish council. It's bigger than any of our local towns. And we're not going to make decisions. We're going to set up a citizens' assembly to tell us what we need to do. And we, the parish council, will then do our best to make these things happen. And if we need to find out who are the experts on making a new council tip, we'll ask you to tell us. They got all but one seat on the council. They set up the citizens' assembly, and it is running. That is totally legal within the UK's democratic system. And it's impossible to live within that and not understand that there's a different way of doing things. So I think we need to come at this from all angles. We could have distributed democracy across Britain before the next election. We could have distributed democracy across Europe, probably not in Germany in time for the elections, which are 3 days from now. But we could have deliberative, distributed democracies in place. And once people have been given that level of agency, it's good and it's useful. And then what you do is you say, okay, the parish council elects 1 or maybe 2 people. They send up to the next level, whatever the strategic level is. And all meetings are held openly on camera so that you can see. And if your representative is not representing you in the way that you want, you have the right of total recall instantly. Sorry, you're not doing it. Come back. We'll send someone else. And at each layer that goes up, and you get to government layer where the people have been sent up and there's a right of recall at each point. And the government is not there to make decisions. The government is there to implement the decisions that the lower levels require of it. It's not hard. It's all out there. We could literally have this up and running by the end of the month. Probably not this month, next month, if we really wanted. And so partly you let people live it. But I also think I've been talking to some people in film and television, because at the moment, all of our film and television is our modern era's equivalent of sitting around the fire telling each other stories. It's the way that we rehearse the stories of who we are. And all of it is given to business as usual and the value set of the trauma culture. And I know a lot of writers who would really like to write television that is not like that, and it will not get past the commissioners. So I am also planning a big Thrutopian convergence. There's a lot of moving parts in this, but basically I want the commissioners from Netflix to want to be there, and BBC, and all of the television, and Taylor Swift, and the people who write Hollywood movies and Marvel things, because I don't think they really want to be writing propaganda for the old system. But they are, because they don't understand, as we've been saying all the way along, that there are other possibilities. I think there is time to swerve the bus from the edge of the cliff, but I think we need the political movement. That's why Any Human Power is the book that it is. This is how a political movement looks and feels. And we need all generations. It needs to be multi-generational. We need to drop all the schisms that have been so carefully engineered. There was a really interesting paper a few years ago, and I can't remember, someone in the States, as ever, and they were looking to see how fast schisms arose in the social media space, and they decided it was the pineapple on pizza, yes or no, because they had to find something neutral. That was as neutral as they could get. And so they kind of seeded that out, and within a day, you had the group screaming at each other that's either pineapple on pizza is un-American, or these people are trying to take your human rights by not letting you have pineapple on pizza. And there were bot farms piling in. The number of actual people in the beginning saying one or the other is vanishingly small. but it was amplified and amplified and amplified in the way that the bot farms are set up to do. And by the end of the day, it's become a trigger point. And we need, it doesn't matter. There is no pineapple and no pizza on a dead planet. We in whatever is the space that we're no longer calling the progressive left, have to let go of our tendency to scream at each other across tiny and pointless divides. And we have to coalesce around a set of values we all agree on and a narrative that will take us forward. And we need a political movement, and we need it about yesterday. And we need it across the world. And it will grow from the bottom up. Grassroots, but we also have to provide the frameworks and the idea space. We need to heal. I lean heavily into Thomas Hübel's concepts of trauma being a moment frozen in time, and I don't want us all to get into the "oh my God, I'm wounded" victim state, but we need to do our own internal work so that we don't get triggered. Triggered people are easy to control. We need to grow up. Bill Plotkin has this thesis that every human being goes through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and elderhood, and each of these is split into two, and that our culture is locked in early adolescence, and that this is the nature of the trauma. The trauma holds us in early adolescence, that we can get all the way through to a very late death and never grow out of early adolescence. We need to grow up. Those of us who are adults and elders need to actually become worthy of those names very quickly, and that means facing the bits inside that we don't really want to face with whatever help we can possibly get. Do the inner work. Free up those frozen parts so that you are flowing. All parts. So I think we need clean air, clean water, clean soil. Clean, clear, courageous, compassionate connections between all parts of ourselves, between ourselves and each other, between ourselves and the web of life. If we could do that, if those are the things that mattered to us, capitalism is over by the end of the day. It just ceases to exist because it's not compatible with any of those as values. We're at the point where the dark triad, which is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, and some people bring in sadism as, let's say a quadrant, our culture elevates that. And if you've ever read The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, it's one of my favourite books, and that they are giving instance after instance of indigenous cultures that lasted for many thousands of years, much longer than our culture, where they had very effective social technologies to make absolutely certain that nobody who embodied the dark triad was getting anywhere near any kind of power. And we just failed on that one. We failed completely. The dark triad, I think one of the really spectacular things about the horror of what's happening in the US at the moment is that the dark triad is now just plainly on view. And the thing is, it was there all along. Much as I would have preferred Kamala Harris to win, the American administration was corrupt. It was basically predatory capitalism waving a pride flag. And instead we have predatory capitalism waving a swastika, which is not good. And I'm not suggesting it is, and it's going to do horrible things to very many people, but at least it's doing it nakedly. And everyone can see the level of corruption. I listened to a fantastic podcast when I was doing the economics. I think it was Nick Tanauer on Pitchfork Economics. And he was talking to someone in Washington, D.C. who said, how many economists do you think the Department of Agriculture has? And the answer was half. They have one bloke half-time who shares they share him with the FDA. How many economists do you think the corn lobby has? Answer, 150. They take up 3 floors of whatever is the high-rise. It's this poor bloke on his half-time. There's 150 people funneling into him. Guess what? The corn lobby does really, really well when the Department of Agriculture comes to making decisions. And that level of corruption is not sustainable. We had the best democracy money can buy. And that's not useful. Now we need proper democracy where we actually engage people and allow that people are creative. Every single one of us. Our ancestors go back to we were hydrogen boiling in the sun. Every single one of us, our ancestors go back to those 1,024 people, 800, 900,000 years ago, and their children lived long enough to have children who lived long enough to have children all the way down the line to us. The chances of our being here are astronomically small. And so we are all miracles of evolution, and we all have a place to play in the web of life. We just need to work out what it is. And treating people as if they were miracles of evolution who had something to do in the web of life, and giving them the agency and the empowerment to become the best that they can be, is the only way through that I can see. And when you do that, when you start to give people agency and empowerment, they really like it, and they step up and they take it. I think things are shifting very fast, but we need the narrative of potential. And if we don't have it, other people, because the critique, the system was corrupt and inefficient, is true. And Reform UK and all the hard right, that's their critique, and it's true. What we differ on is we're going, and here's a flourishing future where we trust everybody, and we need to connect to the web of life, and they're going in-group, protected but not constrained, out-group, constrained but not protected. You want to be in the in-group, you join us now. And that speaks deeply at a limbic level to people.
Looking forward to connecting again. Thank you to all the listeners, and until next time.